Hello and welcome to another Reaconteur video, and in today's video I'll be comparing old Type Soul from a year ago under its old development team to the new Type Soul today under the current development team. Make sure to subscribe since only about 20% of the people watching right now are actually subscribed. And also I'm releasing 2 song covers this month, so buy a YouTube membership if you want to hear me sing. Now let's get straight into it. Alright, so first of all, old Type Soul was really confused on if it wanted to be permadeath or not. The game's progression and systems were overall way more punishing. On death, Soul Reapers would have their Reatsu capped by 10% per death, Arancars would have their health capped, and Quincy's would have both their health and Reatsu capped because the devs have always hated Quincy's. This would last until you killed an equal amount of players to the deaths that you had, and every death would cap it more until your maximum was around 50%. So you could just respawn with half as much health or Reatsu or half as much health and Reatsu, and you're just expected to kill people with those debuffs. Along with that, the game was even more punishing with its progression systems. If you wanted to get Vastakar, the grind was way higher since mass cracks were not only lost on every death, but they were a 15% chance to get on killing another Ajuchas NPC. So on average, you would need to kill about 175 Ajuchas NPCs to get all 25 mass cracks, which is a lot since Ajuchases are the rarest NPC type in Hueco Mundo. And on top of all that, if you died at any point after getting White Ajuchas, including to the Vastalorde NPC, you would get completely locked out of getting Vastakar. So if you wanted it, which you did because of how broken the true variants were, and just Cero Scudas is really good, you had to soul ticket and redo your entire build progression, which just isn't fair. Because you could also just like die in a laggy server or disconnect, or the servers would shut down, and back then if a server shut down while you were in combat, you died. There was really nothing you could do, and the progression was just super stupid. And I almost forgot, but it actually wasn't 25 mass cracks before, it was 50, so double that number I said earlier. So 175? No, you needed on average like 350 Ajuchas kills, and they were even rarer than they were now, and they're still the rarest NPCs in the game. And I almost forgot to mention, but the game's actual progression was just so much worse back then. There were, first of all, time gates. Like if you see that little thing at the top of your screen that says ready to level up, it doesn't do anything now, but back then that was kind of needed because every time you would grade up, every time the timer would get longer, and the top of that would show you if you were waiting enough time to grade up. Luckily, this would go down while you were offline, so you could finish all your grinding and then get off for the night, go to sleep, and wake up, and you'd probably get a grade up. But it was just really annoying having to wait like an hour, 4 hours, 8 hours, 16, and then 24 hours for elite grade, which was just super dumb. And also, for some reason back then, you got 10 points at semi-elite, and then elite grade gave you nothing. So like, there was no difference in strength between a semi and a full elite grade. There was really no reason for that. They just decided to be weird with it. But also, the progression was just so much worse because it took so many more quests. And if you know anything about raid grips, oh my god, it was impossible. Killing people in raids as a grade 2 just is not something you can do by yourself, unless you get super lucky and can like steal away a kill, because there was no way that you're going to beat anyone in a raid, and just on the off chance you did, you had like 5 other elite grades trying to steal your grips for some reason because they were just idiots. It was awful. And then the true variants made this so much worse because you had to progress for those as well. But also, speaking of old Vastakar, let's talk about all the old true variants. Last time I talked about this, so many people who didn't know what they were talking about were trying to correct me on stuff that's just wrong. I mentioned that the old Vastakar speed variant, which gives you 3 consecutive flash steps. That's what it did. It was broken, yes. But people were trying to tell me that that didn't exist, and it was just the dodge variant back when it had 2 dodges. No! You got 3 flash steps from the old Vastakar speed variant, and this was absolutely insane. I shouldn't really have to tell you why, but if you know what Espada Sonido is, it was basically just Espada Sonido passively. And back then, the other 2 variants were also insane. The old regeneration variant was generally considered the best, because if you guys remember Visored Reatsu regen, well, all you have to do is imagine that much regen, but on your health bar. The regeneration variant for Vastakar was just passive double or triple health regen, and yeah, they nerfed it, making it ramp up a little bit so it would start slower and get faster until you got hit, but that really didn't matter because you could just run around for 15 seconds and heal a bar and a half of health. The worst variant back then, ironically, was the Hierro variant, And even that was way stronger than it is today when it's considered the best, well, second best behind proficiency. But back then it used to give a 10% damage buff alongside its defense buff, which was just really good to have passively. And as for the other true variants, if you had Visored Mastered and Bankai, you would get True Bankai, which not the same thing that they're making now where it's just like a second mode, kind of like Segunda. Back then it was just a 50% damage buff to your Bankai in mode at all times. This was insane because back then every mode was just way stronger, and a great example of this would be Stark's Cerro Metralleta. It used to do around 4 bars of damage with a single one, which is insane for a reason I'll explain later. The one Cerro Metralleta you had back then did more damage than the 2 we have now with Segunda, and basically every mode including Bankais were about that strong, maybe a little bit weaker. Stark was really strong even back then, like for the standards, but everything was just way stronger back then than they are today. So add a 50% damage buff onto it and you have something that's too strong to exist, which is why it doesn't exist and it was actually removed, because that just should have never existed. Especially with things like the old Blood Bankai, which for those of you who don't know, I mentioned it actually pretty recently in another video, but the old Blood Bankai had complete no stun, grab moves, any sort of hit. You just couldn't stun, ragdoll, or basically hit anyone with Blood Bankai, because as soon as they activated it, they would get lifesteal equivalent to the damage that they were doing, but then on top of that, they would just have complete true no stun. Like, and I mean it was true no stun. Like, you couldn't even tell you were hitting them. You just had to hope that they were taking damage through their hyper armor, because you can't even tell that you were hitting them. And as for Quincy's, because the devs hate them, most of their current Shrifts and Volstone issues didn't even exist publicly. This wasn't a huge downside since most people didn't have modes back in my day anyway, but this was important because it goes back to the problem with the old CC players. Since almost every Volstern ditch was locked behind one of the 26 Sternritter slots, which I get it's accurate to the show, but your game has 40,000 people and you're gonna lock one of the 3 factions' main abilities behind CC access, which is like 100 people, and not even all 26 Sternritter spots were taken, but you pretty much couldn't get most Shrifts and you couldn't get most Volstern ditches unless you were a CC player, because only Sternritters could use them, which back then Sternritter also came with the spec of being able to steal Bankais with the Quincy medallion. That was actually pretty cool. Only problem is, you know, it was a spec. Luckily, they are reintegrating it into the game, which is going to be publicly used by players who, of course, achieve its new requirements once it's reworked, but that's going to be really cool, so I'm happy that they're actually doing something with that, because it's a cool mechanic that has a lot of potential. One thing that is consistent between the old and new devs is the desire they have to lock everything they can behind modes nobody wants to play. Both the old and new devs lock a ton of things behind Clan Wars, think like the Jujutsu manual or the Thunder Lightning Shunko, or just pretty much everything new that they add. They're all locked behind Clan Wars, and all the best gear is locked behind the current, which is pretty new, but boss raids. Which is funny because boss raids are not good enough to validate anyone ever wanting to play them, because nobody ever wants to play them, which is why I still don't have the best gear in the game. But speaking of the best gear in the game, in old Type Soul, gear used to be super strong, which is why I said I would mention Cerro Metralleta again. People used to have way more health back then. If you were to take an old Cerro Metralleta and hit a current day player with it, they would die, like just guaranteed. You would not survive that with the current day's gear. And Reiatsu in comparison today is a huge example of this. I don't think I have ever ran out of Reiatsu in old Type Soul. And I main Speed, which has pretty much always been the highest Reiatsu cost tree even back then. Nowadays it's kind of competing with Kido for that title, but back then it was definitely the highest Reiatsu cost tree. Today, running out of Reiatsu is pretty much guaranteed and like every fight, especially against any half-decent player, and in ganks you're going to run out if you don't kill someone. But back then it was a useless bar that you almost never had to pay attention to. And also health values back then were insane, which is why I mentioned the Cerro Metralleta thing. Right now gear is giving like 7.5 health and 1 to 2% damage reduction per item with the best gear possible, but back then the best gear gave you like a total 20% damage reduction with like 70 extra health, and a ton more Reiatsu, which didn't even matter because Reiatsu was way more generous back then than it is today, which is kind of the entire reason why Soul Style exists, to promote people to use them once to get their Reiatsu back. But then most people don't use Soul Style anyway because they're playing Soul Reaper, and they just have more Reiatsu. Earlier I was talking about Sternritters, which brings me back to the abundance of CC players back then. Titles and titled players used to be super common. You could join any given server, and there might have just been an Espada or captain in the middle of Karakura town being surrounded by their legion of CC losers, spamming spec moves if a non-CC or ranked player as much as breathes near them. Nowadays, you barely even see CC or titled players. I haven't seen a single spec user that wasn't a developer, and I've only seen one title or custom name player in the last 3 months outside of testing servers. The new devs really removed a lot of the unfair exclusive stuff and specs, or at least toned them down a lot. Which also, this brings me back to CC players, but oh my god, ranked players as well were basically the same because they got treated like CC players. And I mean like overworld ranked players, back when that actually mattered. I haven't seen an overworld rank in so long. Like, I don't even know if they're still in the game. Because I used to be like top 30 ranked overworld, and what I would do is the method for getting your true res, which you could either do 175 raids back then, which was insane, or you could heal people in raids, which was the second method, or the third method was just staying top 100 ranked or something like that, or just ranked in general, for 24 hours, which was the method that I originally tried to do. And I did get ranked, but I couldn't stay in it for 24 hours because you had to be in-game for 24 hours, and I wasn't going to stay in-game for 24 hours because that is actually painful. So, you know, I stayed in-game for like 9 hours and did 175 raids, which, yeah, absolutely terrible progression, but I wish they brought it back, and I wish they made modes stronger, so that way modes would be much more worth getting and people wouldn't be popping them in 1v1s, which is honestly pathetic. And then on top of that, it's like a lot of really bad players have modes, and it's like, bro, you don't deserve that. You're terrible at this game. But yeah, a good example of, you know, the old toned down specs would be Getsuga Jujisho, which went from being a 4-bar damage nuke blast that would cover the entire arena for like, you know, clan wars or anything else, down to a 2-bar, still very strong but small and now actually avoidable projectile. It is in the game, but nobody has it because it was kind of like, you know, like vaulted, kinda, I guess, Fortnite terms. Yeah, that's about it. But yeah, Getsuga Jujisho, if you don't know what it is the move used by Rukia in her Ice Bankai. Anyway, comparing the balancing of the new and old devs, we can see the new devs are clearly doing a much better job. If you disagree, you're either metamancing way too hard, so stop switching builds every update, or you're biased because you're bad at the game. Comparing balancing now to back in my day, don't call me Unk, we can see the biggest difference in the essence moves. As I said, Getsuga Jujisho, used by Rukia, was a 2-bar damage essence move which was removed and will likely be reworked someday. But that wasn't the only broken essence move. The old devs basically just put a bunch of specs into the essence pool as a way or an attempt to revive the game and get people to play clan wars. Except nobody was really doing it because adding more unbalanced moves to a loot pool for a mode nobody wants to play isn't going to revive the game. And it didn't. The game died shortly after, before the new devs eventually picked it up. And the old devs were also clearly very bad at their jobs because one of them got mad and decided to leak the entire game, which is why the Battlegrounds games were made. Thankfully, the new devs aren't that stupid. Regardless, there is one good thing about the old devs, and it's consistency. The old game was consistently overpowered, so nothing was particularly weak in comparison to anything else, because it was all pretty broken. In the earlier stages of Type Soul's re-release, when things were still trying to get rebalanced, it ended up in a lot of meta instability, since they were focusing more on nerfing things than buffing or reworking. So for a little bit, Hakuda and Kido ended up being a bit too strong, and for a little bit, Kendo and just all that stuff for Soul Reapers ended up being way too strong. Now everything is relatively balanced, but Hakuda, in my opinion, is way too weak as it is. But this video is not really on balancing, it's on comparing the old and the new. So for more comparisons, let's talk about the old systems that were different. First of all, vanity equipment just didn't work. You could not vanity things. The button was there, but it didn't actually let you vanity equip anything. It was broken, and the old devs were just too lazy to fix it, even though, you know, it's like 5 lines of code. And also back then, everything was super rare. For example, weapon and element or Shikai rerolls used to be super high value, being worth the 800 Robux a single Shikai reroll would cost, because the legendary percentage was a third of what it is today, which is 3% in comparison to its old 1%. On top of this, every code gave like 5 rerolls versus the 200 you get per update now, and somehow people still complain about not having enough. Like, you're shit at the fucking game, bro. A new Shikai isn't gonna help you. Regardless, skill boxes and Hogyoku fragments were super rare. So rare, in fact, they used to be worth 15 Shikai rerolls each. Now they're worth like 60 maybe, I don't even know. They're just like not, like everything's just super, like the economy's just worse now. But it was super hard to get skill boxes and Hogyoku fragments, so barely anyone used skill box moves and barely anyone had Vastakar. And almost nobody had True Vasto. In fact, it was so rare, I never even got Vasto and True Vasto until Type Soul's re-release because ranked made Hogyoku fragments super easy to get, and True Hogyokus were, you know, possible to get outside of Clan Wars. So that was actually how long it took me to reach all that stuff. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If I missed anything, leave it in the comment section down below. I love you all. Shoutouts to Kenix, Jake, and Cyberboy21. Buy a YouTube membership if you want to hear my song covers. Regardless, I love you all, and goodbye.